The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in March, and Maren Calloway read it standing at the kitchen window with her boots still muddy from the south field. She did not sit down. She read it twice, folded it along its original crease, and set it on the counter beside the mason jar she used for her morning coffee, the one with the hairline crack running from rim to base that she had never replaced because her grandmother had canned the first tomatoes in it, in the summer of 1967. That jar would come back to her later. Everything does, in this story. What the letter said, she would not tell anyone for 3 days. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over hill country in early March. The trees are still bare, but they are not winter bare anymore. They are gathering something beneath the bark that nobody can see yet. Maren had always understood that kind of silence better than she understood most people, and she had been farming 46 acres of Maury County clay in central Tennessee long enough to know that what you plant in that silence, the decisions you make when nobody is watching and the ground is still cold and everyone around you is telling you to wait or stop or think again, that is what determines everything that comes later. She had been thinking about seed for a long time. Not the kind of thinking that happens in a catalog or a computer screen. The kind that happens at 4 in the morning when you walk the fence line with a flashlight and crouch down and take a fistful of earth in your palm and hold it there, feeling its weight, its drag, its particular stubbornness. Maury County clay is not easy. It compacts. It cracks in July. It holds water in the wrong seasons and refuses it in the right ones. The county extension agent, a man named Dale Pritchett who wore a BOLO tie to every meeting and had never, as far as Maren could tell, grown anything with his own hands, had told her the same thing for 4 consecutive years: plant hybrid corn like everybody else, amend the soil with synthetic nitrogen, accept the yield you're going to get from ground like that. The neighbors, too, had their opinions. Carl Sheppard to the east, who ran 300 Angus cattle and considered himself the authority on everything agricultural within a 10-mile radius, had actually laughed, with the particular ease of a man who has never had to reconsider himself, when he heard what Maren was planning in the spring of 2021. She had mentioned it at the feed store in Columbia, Tennessee, not quite meaning to share it, saying only that she was thinking about going back to open-pollinated varieties, maybe some heritage grain, maybe looking at what the soil actually wanted rather than what the input suppliers were selling. Carl had been buying fence staples 2 aisles over and he had come around the corner still grinning and said that was real cute, that she was going to grow herself some antique crops on 46 acres of pipe clay, that he looked forward to seeing how that worked out for her. He had said it in that particular voice men use when they want to sound friendly while meaning something else entirely. Maren had looked at him for a moment. Then she had paid for her amendments and her inoculant and walked out to her truck without saying anything at all. She had been doing this long enough to know that silence was sometimes the only honest answer. She was 41 years old in the spring of 2021. She had taken over her grandmother Ruth's farm in 2009 after Ruth died in January of that year, quietly, in her sleep, the way people who have worked hard all their lives sometimes do, as though their bodies finally allow them to stop. The farm had not been profitable in years. Ruth had run it on a system of deep knowledge and deep stubbornness, keeping a kitchen garden, selling vegetables at the Columbia Farmers Market on Saturday mornings, raising a small flock of Narragansett turkeys that she had maintained as a breeding flock for over 2 decades because she believed in them even when no one else in the county was running heritage poultry. When Maren inherited the land, it came with debt and 2 buildings in disrepair and 46 acres that the bank's appraiser had described in writing as marginal agricultural land with limited yield potential. She had read that appraisal the same way she read the letter in March. Standing up. Twice. Then she had folded it and placed it in the drawer where she kept things she was not yet ready to burn. The first years were hard in ways she had not anticipated. She had grown up partly on this land, summers with Ruth, springs, a few winters when her parents' situation had required it, but growing up on a farm and running one are entirely different agreements with the earth. One is about wonder. The other is about will. She made mistakes with moisture management in year 1 and lost half her cover crop before December. She miscalculated her fencing costs in year 2 and spent 3 months sleeping 4 hours a night to make ends meet in ways she preferred not to detail. She learned. She read, not just the Extension Office publications, not just the modern agronomy texts, but older things, Wendell Berry, and older than that, books on soil science from the 1940s, USDA bulletins from the Depression era when necessity had made people very honest about what worked. She found a copy of a 1938 Tennessee Agricultural Experiment Station report on clay soil amendment at the library in Nashville, and she read it 3 times on the drive home, pulled over on the shoulder of I-65, because something in it rearranged her thinking about the ground she was standing on. Clay soil is not poor soil. That is what the report kept saying, in the patient, careful language of people who had spent years testing rather than assuming. Clay soil is mineral-rich. It holds calcium, magnesium, potassium in quantities that sandy loam can only dream of. The challenge of clay is biology, not chemistry. Get the biology right, the microbial life, the fungal networks, the organic matter percentage, and clay becomes something closer to a savings account than a liability. Every dollar of biology you deposit, the clay holds and compounds. The wrong crops drain it. The right crops feed it in a cycle that, given time and patience, becomes self-sustaining. Heritage grains had been bred over centuries to work within that kind of relationship. They did not demand that the soil reshape itself around their needs. They had root architectures designed to work with dense subsoils, to reach down past the compaction layer, to find what was there rather than requiring you to manufacture what wasn't. They were slower. They were less spectacular at the yield measurements that modern agriculture used to judge everything. But they were honest about what the land could give. Maren had started reading about red fife wheat in 2018. It had originated in Scotland in the mid-19th century, made its way to Ontario with Scottish immigrants, and had been a dominant wheat variety across North America until the early 20th century when it was displaced by higher-yielding modern cultivars. It had deep roots. Serious protein content. A flavor that bakers and chefs were beginning to rediscover. And it had something else, a documented history of performing in difficult soils because it had been bred before the era of synthetic inputs made difficult soils irrelevant. She had also been reading about Bloody Butcher corn, an heirloom dent corn variety with origins in Virginia around 1845, deep red kernels, used historically for both cornmeal and animal feed, with a root system that went considerably deeper than modern hybrid corn. And about a heritage field pea, Tennessee Crowder, which was not just a heritage variety but a Tennessee heritage variety, something her grandmother had actually grown in the back garden in the 60s before it largely disappeared from commercial availability. The combination was not accidental. It was a system. Wheat in the fall to break the soil surface and add organic matter over winter. Corn in the main season to drive those deep roots down through the clay hardpan. Field peas intercropped to fix nitrogen, drawing from the air what the soil needed but hadn't been given in years of neglect. Each one feeding the next. Each one chosen because it fit, not because a catalog said it was optimal. She had explained this at a Maury County Soil and Water Conservation District meeting in February of 2020. There were 11 people in the room. Dale Pritchett had been there, and Carl Sheppard, and a woman from the county assessor's office who had come for a different reason and stayed out of what appeared to be uncertain obligation. Maren had brought a printed diagram. She had spoken carefully and specifically, using the names of the varieties, citing the 1938 Tennessee study, citing the work being done by the Rodale Institute on heritage grain yields in comparable soils. The room had been quiet afterward for a beat that lasted slightly too long. Dale Pritchett had cleared his throat. He had said that the Rodale Institute was not exactly a mainstream source. He had said that heritage varieties had been replaced for good reasons, namely that the yields simply did not compete. He had said, and this was the part Maren would remember most clearly, years later, standing in a different place entirely, that the farmers who had tried to go backward with their varieties had mostly just gone backward. The men in the room had chuckled. Not unkindly, some of them. Just the easy chuckle of people who have decided how things are. Maren had gathered her diagram. She had thanked them for their time. She had driven home in the dark on Route 412, past the cedar breaks and the limestone outcroppings and the creek bottoms that were already beginning to green at the edges, and she had not felt defeated. She had felt, if anything, more certain. Because there is a particular clarifying effect to being dismissed by people who have not done the work you have done, and she had enough experience now to recognize it for what it was. A sharpening. She planted the red fife in October of 2020, broadcasting seed into 30 acres of clay that she had spent 2 years preparing, cover-cropped with crimson clover and hairy vetch, rolled and terminated, never tilled deeper than 2 inches because she was trying to preserve the fungal networks that deep tillage destroys. The seed came from a small heritage seed company in Vermont that had been maintaining the red fife line since the 1990s. The woman who ran it had spoken to Maren on the phone for 45 minutes about germination rates and seeding density and what to expect from clay-heavy soils. She had said, before hanging up, that Maren was the first Tennessee farmer she'd shipped to in 11 years of business. The wheat germinated in 12 days. By December it had put on a good vegetative canopy and Maren had walked it every morning, watching the color, checking the density, looking for the pale yellow that would signal nitrogen stress or the spotting that would mean rust pressure. Neither came. The winter was cold and wet in ways that favored wheat over weeds, and by the time March arrived, the March of 2021, the one with the letter, the red fife was standing in a way that made the south field look different. Not transformed. Changed in the way that things change when they are becoming what they were always supposed to be. The letter was from a USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service office in Nashville. It was a response to a grant application she had submitted 4 months earlier under the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, a program designed to support farmers implementing conservation practices, including, as of a recent policy expansion, heritage variety cultivation as a soil health measure. She had applied for $12,000 to cover the cost of the specialized seed, the biological amendments, and the documentation she would need to maintain to demonstrate outcomes. The letter informed her that her application had been approved. $12,000. Not a fortune. But enough. Enough to cover the bloody butcher corn seed she had been budgeting for, enough to purchase the remaining biological inputs she needed, enough to build the small grain storage structure she had been sketching on graph paper for 2 months, rough dimensions noted in pencil in the margin, the way her grandmother had always planned things. She stood at the window for a long time after she read it the second time. The south field was visible from where she stood, the red fife winter wheat a low green wash across the clay. The mason jar with the hairline crack sat beside her on the counter, still holding the last inch of her morning coffee, gone cold. She picked it up. Drank the cold coffee. Set it back down. And then she went out to work. The spring of 2021 was the spring she planted everything. The bloody butcher corn went in on the 10th of May, after the last frost date for Maury County, into the 16 acres she had not planted to wheat. She inoculated the seed with mycorrhizal fungi before planting, a step that cost her an additional $340 and that Dale Pritchett, had he known about it, would have dismissed as unnecessary expenditure. The mycorrhizal fungi would colonize the corn roots within weeks and extend their reach out into the clay, accessing phosphorus and micronutrients in the mineral-dense soil matrix that the roots alone could never have touched. It was not a quick return. Biology never is. But it was real. She intercropped Tennessee Crowder peas in the corn rows at a population that would let both crops grow without serious competition, the peas running their vines up the lower corn stalks by midsummer, fixing nitrogen all the while, shading the soil surface and reducing evaporation. Her grandmother had grown these peas. Had shelled them at the kitchen table in July with the window fan running and the radio on, dropping them into the same enamelware bowl for 40 years. Maren had found the bowl in the pantry when she'd inherited the farm, still holding the papery ghosts of the last dried peas Ruth had stored in it, probably the summer before she died. She had kept those peas. She had not tried to germinate them, they were too old, the viability long gone. But she had kept them in a small cloth bag in the same drawer as the appraisal letter, and she thought about them sometimes when she was planting, The way you think about people you learned from even when they are no longer there to tell you anything. Summer came on hard that year. June was dry in Maury County, dry enough that the creek on the eastern boundary of the property dropped to a string of pools by early July, and the cattle operations in the area were hauling water. Carl Sheppard's Angus had eaten his eastern pasture down to dirt by the middle of the month. He had come by in his truck one afternoon, rolling slow down the gravel lane, and Maren had seen him stop at the fence line along the road and look at the bloody butcher corn for a long minute. It was already knee-high. The Tennessee Crowder peas were running. The soil around the base of the plants, where the organic matter had been building for 2 years and the fungal networks were now extensive enough to hold moisture in the clay pores, was visibly different from the soil on the road shoulder, darker, slightly crumbled, smelling of something alive. Carl had not gotten out of his truck. He had driven on. Maren had watched him go from the barn doorway. She had not felt satisfaction, exactly. Just a noting. The red fife winter wheat was harvested in late June of that first year. She had borrowed a small plot combined from a grain farmer 2 counties over, a man named Hoskins who ran Heritage Oats and who had been one of the few people at that conservation district meeting who had not chuckled. The yield from those 30 acres of clay was 38 bushels per acre. The county extension office's own yield data for that year, for hybrid wheat varieties on comparable soil types in Maury County, showed an average of 34 bushels per acre, with the better managed operations reaching 42. Dale Pritchett, when he saw her yield report at the fall meeting, had said that 38 was about what you'd expect, not bad for a heritage variety, though of course the hybrids would have done better on good ground. He had not mentioned that the average on her soil type was 34. She had noted the yield in her farm journal that evening, writing the number in ink in the small spiral notebook she kept for that purpose, June 23, 2021. Red fife, 30 acres, clay soil, no synthetic nitrogen. 38 bushels per acre. Below that she wrote, Year 1. The soil remembers nothing yet. Because that was the truth of it. Year 1 was just asking. Year 2 was when the land began to understand what you were asking for. The summer of 2021's bloody butcher corn came in at the end of September. The yield was not spectacular, she knew it wouldn't be yet. 83 bushels per acre on 16 acres of clay, against a county average that was running somewhere above 140 for modern hybrids on amended ground. What was notable, and what she carefully documented in photographs and written records, was the root structure she excavated from a sample of plants at harvest. She dug 6 plants randomly across the field, pulled them fully, and laid them out in the grass beside the field lane. The primary roots had gone down past 32 inches. Past the hardpan layer. Into the clay subsoil that most modern corn roots never reached. The mycorrhizal colonization was visible as a pale fuzz on the secondary roots. She photographed it, labeled it, filed it in the binder she was building. That binder would matter more than she knew. The Tennessee Crowder peas had done what peas do. The nitrogen fixation from that season's crop, measured through a tissue test she sent to a lab in Knoxville, had added the equivalent of 62 pounds of available nitrogen per acre to the soil biology. 62 pounds per acre she had not purchased. Not hauled. Not applied. Just grown. She replanted red fife that October. 30 acres again, plus a small test plot of emmer wheat, an ancient variety, hulled wheat, older than red fife by several thousand years, with an even deeper root architecture and a documented tolerance for heavy, mineral-rich soils that had been used in Europe and the Middle East since before recorded history. Emmer was a risk. Nobody in Tennessee was growing it commercially. But Maren had found 2 academic papers on its performance in clay-heavy soils in Kentucky and Illinois, and she had decided that a 5-acre test plot was a reasonable wager. She wrote to Dale Pritchett's office that November to share her Year 1 yield data and ask for a follow-up meeting to discuss the results. His office called back and left a message saying the extension agent was very busy through the end of the year and would try to circle back in the spring. He did not circle back in the spring. Winter 2021 into 2022 was the winter Maren worked on her soil data. She had been testing her ground every 6 months since she'd started the program, sending cores to 2 different labs and comparing the results, tracking her organic matter percentage like other people tracked the weather. In the fall of 2019, when she had taken her first baseline samples, the organic matter in her clay ranged from 1.2 to 1.8% across the field. Low. Thin. The number that told the story of what the land had been through. By the fall of 2021, after 2 years of cover crops, heritage grain root activity, P nitrogen fixation, and no deep tillage, the organic matter ranged from 1.9 to 2.4%. Not dramatic. But the direction was unmistakable, and the rate of change was accelerating, because organic matter compounds in soil the same way interest compounds in an account, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. She put that data in the binder. She also, that winter, began selling. The red fife flour was the first product. She had arranged with a small stone mill in Nashville, a man named Everett who had been milling heritage grains for restaurants and bakeries since 2015, to mill her red fife into flour on a custom arrangement. He paid her a premium over commodity wheat prices, 42% above the Chicago Board of Trade price for soft red wheat, because his bakery customers were paying for exactly what she had grown, open-pollinated, documented heritage variety, with the soil health provenance she could prove through her records. The Bloody Butcher cornmeal went to 3 Nashville restaurants directly. One chef, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran who ran a farm-to-table place in the Gulch neighborhood, had driven out to the farm on a Saturday in October, walked the harvested cornfield, picked up the red kernels from the stubble, and said that she had been looking for this corn for 7 years. Word travels quietly in those networks. By spring of 2022, Maren had more orders than she could fill. The second year's red fife yielded 44 bushels per acre. She wrote that in the journal, below the year 1 entry. The Emmer test plot yielded 31 bushels per acre of grain, below the red fife, but the Emmer's root damage to the hardpan was visible when she walked it. The ground had a different feel underfoot in the Emmer plot by the end of the season, a slight give that the rest of the field still lacked. And the organic matter numbers from the Emmer plot, when she tested it separately in October, showed 2.6%. The highest figure on the whole farm. She expanded the Emmer to 15 acres. Carl Sheppard appeared at her gate again in the spring of 2022. This time he got out of the truck. He stood at the fence along the road for a few minutes, looking at the red fife, which was headed out by then, the grain heads filling with the particular pinkish gold that red fife gets when the proteins are developing. He had his hat in his hand. He said something that Maren only partly heard from where she was working in the barn, something about the color of it, how it didn't look like wheat he recognized. She had walked over to the fence. He had asked her, with less ease than usual, what the name of it was. She had told him. Red fife. Heritage wheat. Scottish origins, 1840s. He had nodded slowly. Had put his hat back on. Had said, as if it were a reasonable thing to say and not an extraordinary reversal, looks like it's doing all right. She had agreed that it was. He had driven on. There is a moment in any long effort when the effort stops feeling like something you are doing and starts feeling like something that is simply true, like the work has become its own justification, its own evidence. Maren reached that moment somewhere in the summer of 2022, though she could not have told you the exact date. The farm had a rhythm now. The cover crops, the heritage grains, the field peas, the stone mill relationship, the restaurant buyers, each piece fitted to the others the way good joinery fits, without the gaps that require something extra to hold them together. She was sleeping more than 4 hours a night. Her farm journal had 3 notebooks now, dense with numbers and observations and the occasional pressed plant, a wheat head, a crowder pea blossom, a maple leaf from the edge of the south field, because Ruth had always pressed leaves and Maren was her grandmother's granddaughter in ways that did not require explanation. That summer she also planted, for the first time, a small planting of an open-pollinated grain sorghum, a variety called Mennonite that had been maintained by Mennonite farming communities in Pennsylvania and Ohio since the 19th century. Grain sorghum is drought-tolerant in ways that corn is not, and she had been thinking about climate variability, the way summers in Middle Tennessee had been getting less predictable in her decade of farming there, wetter sometimes, drier sometimes, the patterns her grandmother had described as reliable no longer behaving as Ruth had known them to. The Mennonite sorghum was an insurance policy. A hedge against seasons she couldn't predict. She planted 4 acres of it, almost as an experiment, next to a fence line where the clay was worst and deepest. By the end of August it stood 7 feet tall and had barely moved during a 2-week dry stretch that had the county extension office issuing drought advisories. She noted that too. The fall of 2022 brought a dry harvest and strong grain prices. The red fife came in at 49 bushels per acre, up from 44, up from 38. The emmer came in at 41 bushels per acre on the 15 acres she had planted, a yield that would have seemed modest in any county comparison, but that came off ground that, 2 years earlier, a certified appraiser had described as marginal with limited yield potential. The bloody butcher corn, now in its 2nd year on ground that the roots and peas had been working for a full cycle, yielded 106 bushels per acre. Still below the hybrid average in the county. Still above what anyone who had seen her land in 2019 would have predicted as possible. The organic matter across the field was now averaging 2.9%. That fall she filed an updated report with the EQIP program, documenting her outcomes against the original grant objectives. The report ran to 22 pages. It included soil test data across 6 time points, yield data with comparison to county averages and soil type benchmarks, photographs of root excavations at harvest showing penetration depth, and a financial analysis demonstrating that the premium pricing she was receiving for heritage variety grain was generating gross revenue per acre that exceeded the county average for hybrid variety grain even at the lower heritage yields, because the price per bushel was, in the case of red fife flour, 2.5 times the commodity price. She drove the report to the Nashville NRCS office herself. Left it with the program coordinator, a woman named Susan Briggs who had been in her corner since the original application and who read the cover page standing at the reception desk and said, very quietly, that this was one of the most complete EQIP outcome reports she had received in 14 years of administering the program. Maren had thanked her and driven home. It was on that drive home, Route 412 again, the cedar breaks and limestone, the creek bottom greening in the October light, that she thought about the letter she had received the previous spring. The other letter. The one that had arrived 6 weeks after the NRCS approval, in a plain envelope from a small heritage seed nonprofit in Georgia, asking if she would be willing to be featured in a film they were making about heritage grain farming in the South. She had written back saying yes. The film crew came in November of 2022, 2 people, a woman named Dell who directed and also operated the camera, and a sound recordist named Marcus who moved through the farm with a quietness that Maren appreciated, not needing to fill silence with explanation. They filmed for 4 days. They filmed the grain storage building she had finally finished, its corrugated metal walls and the smell of red fife flour that had soaked into the wood of the shelving. They filmed her walking the emmer field in the morning, the soil test kit in her hand, crouching to look at something only she could see. They filmed the binder, all 3 of them now, for years of documentation, sitting on the kitchen table beside the mason jar with the hairline crack. Dell had pointed at the jar and asked about it. Maren had said it had been her grandmother's. Dell had asked if she could film it. Maren had said she could. It was in the film. That jar, that crack, the morning light through the kitchen window catching the glass in a way that made the crack look like a river on a map. It ran under the title card at the beginning and came back at the end, and people who watched the film later, it would go on to screen at 3 regional agricultural film festivals and get picked up by a documentary streaming service in the spring of 2024, said that they didn't quite know why the jar made them feel what it made them feel. But it did. The winter of 2022 into 2023 was the winter everything accelerated. The film was in post-production. The Nashville restaurant accounts had grown to 9. Everett at the Stone Mill had begun calling her red fife a signature ingredient in his customer relationships, meaning that bakeries and restaurants were specifying her grain by the farm name, Calloway Heritage Grains, which was the name she had put on her grain bags since year 1. Printed on a simple craft paper label she had designed herself at the kitchen table on a laptop that was 4 years old and ran hot when she had too many windows open. A food journalist in Nashville wrote a piece about her for a regional magazine in February of 2023. The piece was not long, 800 words, but it was precise. It mentioned the soil organic matter data. It mentioned the heritage variety names. It mentioned that she had been turned down 3 times by a traditional agricultural lender before receiving EQIP funding, which Maren had mentioned once in passing and which the journalist had apparently found more important than Maren had. Carl Sheppard called her the day after the article ran. He said he had seen it in the magazine. He said his wife had left a copy on the kitchen table and he had read it that morning over coffee. He said, and here his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, something that was not quite apology but was in the neighborhood of one, that he thought she had done something real out there. Maren had said that the land had done most of it. Carl had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said he was thinking about putting in a test plot of something heritage, maybe the sorghum she was running, and he wanted to know who she got her seed from. She had given him the information. All of it, without reservation. Because there was never any value in keeping the knowledge. Her grandmother had known that. Ruth had given seeds to anyone who asked. Had written out planting notes on index cards in her careful hand and pressed them into people's palms at the farmer's market. Had believed, without needing to articulate it, that the health of one piece of ground was not separate from the health of the ground around it, that farming was a conversation between neighbors even when the neighbors thought they disagreed about everything else. Maren believed that too. Spring of 2023 was the spring she knew. She could feel it in the way the field was responding to the rain in March, the way the water was soaking in rather than sheeting off, the way the soil surface had a softness to it that clay soils do not naturally possess, the way her boot sank slightly with each step in a way it had not done 5 years ago. The organic matter testing she did in April of 2023 came back at 3.4% across the field average. One plot on the east side, where the emmer had now completed 3 full root cycles, where the Tennessee Crowder peas had fixed nitrogen for 3 consecutive summers, tested at 3.9%. The threshold that soil scientists define as the point where a soil's biology becomes largely self-sustaining. She stood in that plot with the test results in her hand, the paper fluttering a little in the April wind, and looked at the ground under her boots. Her grandmother had farmed soil that tested at 1.4% organic matter when Maren had first measured it after Ruth's death, depleted by decades of conventional practice that even Ruth, with all her knowledge, had not entirely been able to resist when money was tight and the pressure was to produce. 14 years of Ruth's best instincts. And then 4 years of Maren's specific, documented, science-backed, heritage variety-rooted effort. 3.9%. She did not cry, standing there. She was not given to crying in fields. But her throat tightened in a way that she recognized as the body's acknowledgement of something the mind has known for a while and the heart is only just catching up with. She went back to the house and made coffee in the mason jar. The planting of 2023 was the largest she had undertaken. Red Fife on 30 acres again. Emmer on 15. A full 8 acres of Mennonite grain sorghum, expanded from the successful 4-acre trial. And on the remaining parcels, the Tennessee Crowder peas and a newly sourced heritage field pea variety, iron and clay cowpea, an older variety than the Crowder, with even more aggressive nitrogen fixation documented in warm-season soils. She had corresponded with a plant geneticist at the University of Tennessee over the winter about the cowpea variety selection, and the geneticist, a careful woman named Dr. Aisha Brewer who had spent her career studying Appalachian and Mid-South heritage legumes, had told Maren that the soil data she was generating was among the most detailed farmer-produced datasets she had seen in 20 years of field research. Dr. Brewer visited the farm in May. She walked every field. She knelt in the emmer plot and dug with her fingers and held the dark soil to her nose the way a person holds something they have waited a long time to smell. She photographed the root systems. She asked to see the binders. She sat at the kitchen table with all 4 of them spread open and read for 45 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up and said that she would like to include Maren's farm data in a paper she was preparing on heritage grain soil building potential in Tennessee clay soils, and asked if Maren would be willing to be credited as a contributing data source. Maren had said yes. Summer of 2023 was different from every summer before it. The weather, for one thing, was difficult, a wet June followed by a genuinely punishing July, temperatures at or above 95 degrees for 19 consecutive days, a dryness that came fast after the wet and caught farms that had not built their water-holding capacity through organic matter at a bad time. Maren's fields held. The clay matrix at 3.4% organic matter held moisture at depth in a way that shallow-rooted, low organic matter soils could not. The red fife had headed out by the time the heat came and was past its critical stage. The emmer was deeper-rooted and indifferent. The sorghum, as it had shown in 2022, simply did not care about dry heat in the way corn does. She lost nothing to the drought. She walked her fence line on the 19th consecutive 95-degree day and looked at the standing grain and felt something she would have been embarrassed to name out loud, so she just stood there and let herself feel it without naming it. The county extension office sent out a drought impact survey in late July. She filled it out. Under crops affected by drought conditions, she wrote, none. Under soil moisture management practices, she wrote, heritage variety selection, organic matter building, mycorrhizal inoculation, no-till soil management, 4-year program. Under yield impact estimate, pending harvest. Harvest came in October of 2023. She had Hoskins come with his combine again. He had become something of a regular by now, coming down from his county in late June for the wheat and back in October for the corn and sorghum, and he understood what she was tracking and why, and he was careful with the data. He kept the loads separate by field and weighed everything, printing his scale tickets and handing them to her in a stack at the end of each day. The red fife came in on October 3rd. 30 acres. The scale tickets showed a total of 361 tons. Maren checked the math twice standing beside the combine, the scale ticket in her hand, the afternoon light long and gold across the field behind her. 361 tons across 30 acres. 12 tons per acre. Red fife wheat, grown on Maury County clay soil with no synthetic nitrogen, no herbicides, no fungicides, at 4 years into a heritage grain rotation with documented organic matter building, in a drought year that had damaged conventional operations across the county. 12 tons per acre. The County Extension Service's published benchmark for red fife wheat yield potential in the American Mid-South was 4 to 6 tons per acre. She had read that benchmark in 2019. She had held it in her mind throughout the planning years not as a ceiling but as a data point, one data point among many, produced without the soil building she was doing, without the specific variety management she had developed, without 4 years of fungal networks and root architecture and nitrogen cycling working in the ground before the seed ever went in. She stood in the harvested field until the light was almost gone. The stubble was gold red in the last of it. The ground under her boots had that softness, the 3.4% softness, the biological softness, the kind that takes years to build and is invisible to anyone who hasn't watched it develop inch by inch. She took her phone out of her pocket and called Dr. Brewer. When the geneticist answered, Maren said, the red fife came in at 12 tons. There was a pause on the line. Then Dr. Brewer said, say that again. Maren said it again. Dr. Brewer was quiet for several seconds. Then she said that she was going to need to see the scale tickets. Not because she doubted them. Because she was going to need them for the paper. The emmer came in 2 days later. 15 acres, 7.5 tons per acre, above the benchmark for emmer in comparable soils by 40%. The Mennonite grain sorghum came in at 8 acres, 6 tons per acre, in a drought year. The Tennessee Crowder peas had produced a small secondary harvest. She'd let a portion of them dry for seed, and the dry yield was enough to maintain her own supply plus a surplus she would sell to 2 other farmers who had asked her, over the previous year, where she sourced them. She wrote the October numbers in the Farm Journal. The 5th notebook now. Red ink, because she had run out of black, which was not symbolic but became one of those small accidents that feels afterward like intention. the October 2023 harvest numbers written in red ink in a black-covered spiral notebook, on a table beside a mason jar with a hairline crack. The word traveled, as words do in agricultural communities, in the particular way news travels when it is news nobody expected. The scale tickets,